Hello, y'all. Welcome back for period 4. This is a big period, a very large one, and it's been a long time since we talked about it, so we're going to jump right in. Historical period 4 is basically what I think of as the antebellum period. Remember that antebellum usually refers to the time in the 1800s in the United States before the Civil War. So as you can see, our dates here are 1800, which is the election of Thomas Jefferson, something that we're going to be talking about a good bit in a second here, all the way through what's usually considered the end of the Jacksonian or the antebellum era, which they have pegged here as 1848. You'll notice that there's some overlap between this unit and the next unit. We'll talk about that more in historical period 5, but I think that the 1848 year here specifically is to be inclusive of the Seneca Falls Convention, the major women's rights convention that I will mention all the way at the very end of this video. So basically, Jefferson through like stopping before we get to the road to the Civil War, right, which is where the next unit picks up. So, first key concept here asks you to look at politics in this time period. There's a lot going on in politics. 1800 to 1848 basically encompasses kind of three distinct political eras that you can see kind of stair-step listed at the bottom there. So we have first the Jeffersonian era, which is Jefferson and then sort of Democratic Republicans like him after him. So it starts from Jefferson's election in 1800. That election is commonly referred to as the Revolution of 1800 for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's the first election to get that's like not decided in the not decided in the electoral college, but instead gets thrown to the House of Representatives. Right, it's like a split vote. Nobody wins a majority in the electoral college. And number two, and I think more significantly, what happens at this election is that the current president, John Adams, who's a Federalist, loses to Jefferson, his vice president, who was a Democratic Republican. And so for the first time in American history, we have power changing hands from one political party, the Federalists, to a new political party, the Democratic Republicans, and it happens peacefully. Like, John Adams isn't happy about it. He doesn't go to Jefferson's inauguration. Is one of a few presidents to not do that. But he doesn't like barricade himself inside the White House or anything. So for a lot of people, the election of 1800 was like proof that the Constitution works, right? Like this whole kind of like wacky idea that we had where the people will change their minds and say, no, this is what we want in the government, and then that'll happen, right? We don't have a dictatorship, the elections matter. This is the sort of proof of concept for that. So that's why it's a big and significant election. The Jeffersonian era generally ends with the War of 1812, which starts in 1812 and ends in 1815. So just sort of depending on the periodization, you may see people labeling the Jeffersonian era as ending either at the beginning of the War of 1812 or at the end of the War of 1812, which again is in 1815. The period right after the War of 1812 is usually referred to as the era of good feelings. There's some debate amongst historians about whether this is an accurate terminology, but it is one that we use. So we want to remind ourselves of what's going on there. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide, but remember that the key feature here is that we really only have one political party. The Federalists have gone away, and we've got the Democratic Republicans, and like we're expanding, and federal power is going great, and it's like a generally considered to be a not very contentious period in American politics, maybe rightfully or maybe wrongfully. 1824, when the era of good feelings officially ends, that is the election that Andrew Jackson loses, what we often call the corrupt bargain election. If you recall, Andrew Jackson and three other guys all run for president in 1824. There's no clear winner. They all basically divide the electoral college vote relatively evenly, but Jackson has the plurality of votes. So he doesn't have a majority. I think he's like 32% or something like that. But he has a pretty clear plurality, is more than anybody else. So he thinks, well, of course, the House is going to give him the election. But many people inside of the House, including Speaker of the House Henry Clay, who was one of the losers of the election, think that Jackson is like dangerous and that he's not going to be a good president. So they instead toss the election to John Quincy Adams. Jackson is furious, declares a vengeance quest, right? Founds the Democratic Party. He's going to come back 4 years later in 1828 and win election, and that is the beginning of the Jacksonian age. The Jacksonian era basically goes until the road to the Civil War starts. That 1846 date, that's when James K. Polk is elected, and Polk is our first kind of like expansionist, the Mexican-American War guy, right? So there's sort of like three eras. Another way of looking at this, and one of my absolute favorite review tools that I highly recommend checking out, is this big PDF timeline that's really zoomable that that is a flowchart of like all American political parties across like the whole time period of American constitutional existence. Throughout the rest of these review videos, you'll see me kind of taking clips of this because I think it's a really good illustration of what's going on with the political parties. That can be kind of hard to remember. So if you're looking at this right here, this is the time period of this unit. So at the start, all the way back in 1790, you can see the Democratic Republicans up at the top. That's the green line, and then the Federalists down at the bottom. That's the purple line, and then you can see the Federalists sort of dying out mostly as a result of the War of 1812, taking the unpopular position. If you remember talking about the Hartford Convention, when a bunch of Federalists like protest the war and say they're going to secede, right? And then like we end the war like a week later. Oopsie. That's a big part of the Federalist Party kind of dying out. And then we have the era of good feelings, which is kind of this weird period in the middle here where the parties have sort of merged, and it's like, well, if everybody's a Democratic Republican, then that's not really like a meaningful label. This is the presidency of James Monroe and Madison a little bit, and mostly James Monroe, right? Is this the era of good feelings right here? And then we see the split, right, as Andrew Jackson loses to John Quincy Adams, and those are the two other contenders there, and then sort of into a much more complicated period of American politics, which we'll talk about further down the line in a couple more slides. Historians often divide, political historians often divide American political history into sort of party system eras. So the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists right here, this is the first party system that we had, the first time that we have two parties, and then you could sort of wipe the board clean, and then the second party system eventually is going to be the Democrats and the Whigs, and that's, like I said, we'll get to that more towards the end of this set of notes. If you want to link to this whole PDF, which I highly recommend, there's one of these available for you on Canvas, and you can see it's linked in the slides as well. Other kind of political thing that you need to know about this time period, I guess especially the Jeffersonian era of good feelings into the early Jacksonian era, is that this is a time period when martial court is happening. There are really two eras of the Supreme Court that you need to know something about for the APUSH test. This one here, martial court, and then Warren Court, which is in the 1950s and the 1960s. They're named after the Chief Justices at the time. This is, martial court is under Chief Justice John Marshall, as a sort of distant cousin of Thomas Jefferson's, although they did not like each other. And he is appointed in 1801, right in time for the sort of seminal Supreme Court case, Marbury versus Madison, which is the one that decides basically that the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review. Broadly, there's sort of two things that you need to know about martial court, and they are basically the same two things that like are going on in the American government more broadly in this time period. And one is that martial court decisions tend to be either pro-central government, like they are decisions that strengthen the power of the federal government in some way. Marbury versus Madison gives more power to the Supreme Court. McCulloch versus Maryland says that implied powers, and specifically the national bank, are constitutional and that states can't overrule them. So those are like some good examples there. The other thing that martial court cases will do sometimes is they will be pro-business. We're in sort of the period of the Industrial Revolution. That's going to be a big topic for our next few slides. This is the era of sort of early industrialization and business development in the United States. So we get decisions like Dartmouth College versus Woodward, which says that like states can't just like override a private business's like contract, or Fletcher versus Peck is another one that upholds like business contracts essentially, but between two people. So martial, if you're looking at a question and it's dealing with a martial court case, it's going to be either pro-federal government, that's probably more likely, or it's going to be more sort of either pro-business or just sort of pro-property, individual property rights in general, like pro-capitalist, basically. And that's also true of what's going on with the federal government. Even though we have the Democratic Republicans in charge, and in theory, at least, they were more states' rights and more for a small federal government, that's not really what we see happening, right? The martial court decisions are quite powerful here. Some of those Democratic Republicans are kind of sliding more towards, you know, the federal government power once they get into the federal government. So in general, this whole kind of like early 1800s time period, we're seeing sort of like a steady growth of like central or federal government power, and not even growth sometimes, but sort of confirmation of the constitutionality of federal government power. Next key concept, kind of related, is early sort of foreign policy or early diplomacy. Diplomacy and foreign policy are a much bigger part of this course later, right? Sort of like 1890 onward, right? Imperialism onward. But you do need to have a general sense of some of the sort of like early American attempts at diplomacy or foreign policy, lots of which are happening in the Western Hemisphere, right? Sort of in areas that are today the United States, against some of our kind of like near neighbors. A couple terms in particular that are on here. Number one, please keep in mind that if you get a question about diplomacy and it's in the 1800s, you can talk about Native Americans and Native American wars, because in this time period, we considered Native Americans to be essentially like separate governments, kind of. Domestic dependent governments is the term that the Supreme Court uses. And so we're making treaties with them, as you do with any foreign country, right? We make a treaty with Japan, right? We make a treaty with the Cherokee Nation. So any of the Indian Wars that we're going to kind of talk about, foregoing, those are something that you could discuss or could talk about in terms of like discussing American diplomacy in this time period. Other examples of diplomacy or foreign policy, we buy the Louisiana Purchase from French, or from Napoleon, specifically in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. And then we send the Lewis and Clark expedition out to do basically surveying and diplomacy with the native tribes that we find out there. Poor Jefferson also thinks we might find woolly mammoths, which we do not, but too bad. Another really kind of key high point in like American diplomacy or foreign policy in this era is the War of 1812, as I mentioned, right? 1812 to 1815. This is us versus the British. It's worth just thinking about this in sort of two ways. Number one, the sort of versus the British part is like the American Revolution part two, right? The British are kind of still treating us like colonies. They are impressing our sailors. This is the thing where they're like stopping American ships and then kidnapping sailors off of them and forcing them to join the British Navy. No fun. That's a colonial treatment. And they also have not fully left all of the forts in our Western territories. They're sort of claiming that they're part of Canada, and they kind of foot dragging. So that's the sort of problems with the British. The British are still treating us like colonies, and the War of 1812 will basically resolve that. The other part of this is that this is also a part of the ongoing Indian Wars as well. Allied with the British is going to be a League of Native Americans called Tecumseh's League, which is not on here for some reason. That is a big omission. But Tecumseh, remember, is one in a series of Native American chiefs that we see who have sort of a vision of like a pan-Indian, a multi-tribal kind of coalition to fight against, settler colonialism, basically, but against the Americans in this time period. And Tecumseh gathers Native Americans from like the Ohio, Detroit area all the way down into Florida to come together and like side with the British in hopes of forcing the Americans to like stop their expansion and set up like a buffer state that's controlled by like Native Americans. That was sort of the vision here. And so the sort of very fierce fighting in the War of 1812 between just like American soldiers and like, let's say the Seminole, for example, down in the southern part of the war that don't even involve British soldiers at all. So the War of 1812 is sort of two overlapping wars, right? A war against the British and also a war against various Native American tribes, mostly under the leadership of Tecumseh. The War of 1812 ends with the Treaty of Ghent, which takes care of the British thing very nicely, right? We are on good terms with the British from 1815 onward, and it, as we've said in other videos, does not really take care of the Native American issues in any sort of substantial way, right? Tecumseh is defeated and killed, as is sort of like most of his supporters and allies, and the American Westward Movement project will continue. During the era of good feelings, we signed several treaties. This is like when we're finally kind of like a nice, like adolescent country that other countries are willing to do business with. So we sign like the Treaty of 1818 with Great Britain that sets our northern boundary with Canada. We sign the Adams-Onis Treaty, Adams-Onis maybe. That's the treaty with Spain that gives us Florida, yay, question mark. And also that sets the southern boundary between like where Mexico is today, though Spain at the time. And then maybe most significantly, if you look at American foreign policy or diplomacy in this time period, is the Monroe Doctrine, which is so significant it gets its own slide. This is the first of a whole bunch of presidential doctrines that we're going to see. If it says it's a doctrine, it is a statement of foreign policy. That is how we use this word. So the whoever doctrine, whatever the president is, and it's followed by doctrine, that is the president's statement of foreign policy. And so this is James Monroe's statement of foreign policy. It's actually written by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who will be president next. And as the slide says, it does a couple of things. It's sort of from America to European powers. And it's saying, hey, Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Don't come over here and try to recolonize all of these new Latin American countries that are becoming independent in the 1820s, like Mexico in 1821, say, for example. Instead, you should stay over there in your old world with your kings and your monarchs, and we, the United States, we will be the like dominant power in the new Republican, smaller Republican world, right, in the Western Hemisphere. So this asserts our independence in foreign policy. It asserts our sort of dominance over the Western Hemisphere. If you had me in class, you may remember me calling this America's small yappy dog phase, because can we back this up in 1823? No, we cannot. We have like no navy. We just barely survived war with Great Britain in 1812. We are in no way capable of actually, if Britain, whatever, Germany wanted to send over a bunch of ships and take over Bolivia, we wouldn't necessarily have been able to stop that in this time period. But it is a statement of how we see ourselves, and especially good to connect this to the sort of surge of nationalism and just kind of American patriotism that we see in the country after the War of 1812, right? That's one of its big effects. And Monroe Doctrine is mostly significant because later presidents, namely Teddy Roosevelt, will sort of pick this up later and be like, oh, hey, remember when we said that thing like 70 years ago, 80 years ago? Now we mean it. So we'll talk about this one later. So that's some foreign policy stuff. The next one up is looking at one of the big sort of developments in the 1800s, which is that we are increasingly going to see regional politics, that is sort of like the politics of South versus North, becoming significant in broader American politics. We've always had regional differences, right, all the way back to the founding of the colonies, where you have like, the Chesapeake in the South that are plantation based, and in New England we have town meetings, and like so there have always been differences between and amongst the colonies, but this is the era where we start to see like essentially regional politics and regional identity develop, where to some people by 1848, it is very meaningful that they are a Southerner, maybe almost as meaningful or maybe even more meaningful than like I am an American. And that's something that'll escalate right as we get closer to the Civil War. So two good examples of regional interests in politics in this time period. One is how the Henry Clay's American system is sort of received and played out. Whoopsie. Henry Clay's American system first. So Henry Clay, big figure in this time period, a politician. He's in the House, he's in the Senate, he runs for president like 3 times, 4 times, something like that. In this time period in 1816, he's still a pretty young congressman. He had just come into Congress during the War of 1812. He is from Kentucky, which makes him a Westerner in this time period. So he's from sort of like one of the new American states. And what he proposes in 1816 is something that he calls his American system. The proposal here, the goal here, is to economically unite the country, to sort of create like federal subsidies, federal sort of funding for projects that will allow like more trade and commerce sort of within and between the states of the United States. The American system had 3 basic parts. Number one, the federal government is going to fund what Clay called internal improvements. We would probably call this infrastructure today. So this is things like building roads that go between states, bridges. This is right at the beginning of the canal boom. So it was like, oh, we could build canals too. So federally funded infrastructure. Also, Henry Clay wanted to bring back the Bank of the United States. During the War of 1812, the first bank's charter had elapsed, and so we had like nothing. There's no real place that we were putting our money. So he wants to bring back the Second Bank of the United States, which is a feature of a stronger federal government. And to pay for all of this, he proposed a tariff. Remember that Alexander Hamilton had proposed a tariff in like 1791 as part of his original plans, and it got shot down because there just weren't that many people in Congress in 1791 who were like pro-business at that point. But by 1816, there are, right? Things have changed. The Industrial Revolution has started, as we'll talk about. So this tariff passes. The Second Bank of the United States is chartered as well. And the federally funded improvements kind of like some of them happen and some of them don't. We're going to get like the Cumberland Road and a few others. But for the most part, that one is a little bit compromised. The American system is considered something that winds up having like a regional reaction in politics. People in the North generally tended to be in favor of this. This sort of benefits business broadly. People in the West, again, West meaning like Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee, also generally tended to favor it because it would make them more connected economically, easier for them to trade and travel and things like that. And then people in the South generally did not tend to like this. The good thing for you to recall in the grand tariff debate that will last for like a century plus in American history is that in the North, generally tended to like tariffs because they help businesses and lots of Northerners own businesses. In the South, generally tended to not like tariffs because they hurt consumers, they make things cost more, and in the South, most people are consumers, right? They go cash crops, they get that cash, and then they buy their stuff, right? They're not necessarily making it themselves. So that's broad, right? And there were exceptions, but in general, things like the American system are going to be opposed in the South and are sort of part of the beginning of this regional, like, separating of American politics. The other kind of political thing in this time period that is a great kind of preview of how regional interests are starting to become dominant is 2 names. It's called the Missouri Compromise sometimes, or the Compromise of 1820. Those are the same thing. Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1820, same thing. The Missouri Compromise, aka Compromise of 1820, starts out as a debate over the expansion of slavery. That is the key and number one thing you need to know about it. Specifically, the new state of Missouri here is going to be basically the first state that wants to come in out of the Louisiana Purchase if we ignore Louisiana, which was already pretty settled when we got it. So Missouri is sort of our first like little settler state that wants to come in. And there is some debate basically over should Missouri be admitted to the Union as what we call a slave state, which is a state where slavery is legal, Or should Missouri be admitted as a, quote, free state, a state where slavery is outlawed? The debate over this gets really heated, in particular because Southerners are worried that at the time, before Missouri, we have an equal number of free states and slave states in the Senate. It's called the balance of power in the Senate. And so they feel like, okay, this sort of protects us and it protects the institution of slavery. If Missouri comes in, then that like upsets the balance of power. Oh no, right? Slavery is under attack. So this kicks off this whole panic, work in Congress shuts down, and Henry Clay, riding to the rescue with a compromise, proposes this compromise that you see here on the screen, which says, okay, all right, Missouri will come in as a slave state. It's why it's one of the northernmost slave states, even all the way up to the Civil War. And in exchange, Maine, which has been a territory for a long time and is like basically ready to become a state, we'll let that one come in as a free state, so we keep our balance of power in the Senate, right? Yay. And then says Henry Clay, well, we don't have to do this every single time a new state comes in. So we'll just take the remaining territory that we have left, which remember only includes the Louisiana Purchase at this point. We don't have any of this purple or yellow stuff yet. And we're just going to draw a line across it. We're just going to draw a line kind of arbitrarily decided at 3630, it's basically like under the state of Missouri. And so any new territory that becomes states like above this 3630 up here, this is all going to be free eventually. And then any new states that come in below it, that will be slave states, right? Those will be states where slavery is allowed. If this looks a little uneven to you, that's because nobody in this time period really ever anticipated that we would be settling like the Dakotas. That was pretty much seen as like wasted or useless territory. Sorry, Dakotas. But so the 3630 line was considered this sort of like this compromise. The big, I think, ongoing thing to understand about the Missouri Compromise, this proves that in 1820, number one, slavery was a contentious national issue already in 1820, right? It was already something that could kind of like grind us to a halt. But number two, in 1820, it was not yet so divisive that we could not effectively compromise. Like, this compromise works. We're going to basically not fight about this again for about another 30 years. When we get to the Civil War, it's going to be, we've gotten to the point where things are so divisive that a compromise can't work or doesn't work anymore. So again, if we're following kind of continuity and change over time, this is evidence that, at some point we could compromise over slavery, and then at some point that will stop being effective. So that's kind of regional politics, basically. Next couple of slides that we're going to be dealing with, these two particular key concepts here, 4.5 and 4.6, deal with the Industrial Revolution. This is a really, really big one. New innovations in technology, agriculture, and commerce. And commerce, remember, just means trade, like buying and selling things. And then how they impacted various segments of the American society. So first off, the Industrial Revolution is a term for this sort of broad change in the economy that starts in about 1790, right about the same time that the American government gets going. It goes for about the next century, right? It's definitely going through 1890, arguably through the early 1900s, 1910s, arguably through the first couple world wars, right? It's really, there's a lot of potential endpoints, but it's definitely going on for the full century of the 1800s. And so the College Board on the AP exam and the APUSH curriculum typically differentiates between sort of two halves of the Industrial Revolution, the half before the Civil War and the half after the Civil War. This half that we're in right now, the half before the Civil War, the first part of the Industrial Revolution, the College Board will usually refer to as the market revolution, because they're concentrating on the fact that the big change here is a change in markets. We're buying and selling things nationally instead of buying and selling them more locally or individually. The second half of the Industrial Revolution after the Civil War, which we'll obviously get to in a future video, is usually referred to as industrial capitalism. So those are kind of two terms that are like a way of dividing up the Industrial Revolution. So Industrial Revolution starts in the United States kind of in the 1790s. Really key early things are the patenting of the cotton gin, which is in 1794. That's a really big one. And then the beginnings of the first mills, the first factories. There's a couple of kind of early ones in Rhode Island in the 1790s, but really the Lowell mills, which are founded in 1812 or the 1810s in Massachusetts. Those are the first big kind of factory system in the United States, and textiles become the big kind of central industrial product of the U.S. The map that you're looking at here with all the purple dots, those are all showing how many people in New England were employed in the textile industry in 1830 is when that map dates to. In addition to textiles, we're also doing other stuff. We have lumber and sawmills where we're making a lot of lumber wood, right, to build things with. We're making canned food, clocks and mechanics, guns, all sorts of machinery parts, those types of things. So it's not just textiles, but that is definitely a dominant part of the early Industrial Revolution. Along with With the market revolution and the early industrial revolution, we also have the transportation revolution. These two things are connected. You can't have one without the other. You need transportation to sell things, and then transportation needs inventions and innovations, right, to move itself along. You need to have a general sense of when some of the major transportation innovations happen, sort of like the order that they happened in. In particular, I think most useful and most significant is having a really strong sense of when the railroad boom is. Like, is anything that you're talking about, is it happening before railroads, or sort of during the height of the railroads, or after railroads? So railroad boom basically is like railroad are invented in the 1840s. That's when we see the first railroads and tracks laid in the United States. But the 1850s is really when the first kind of like wave of tracks are built. They're a big deal during the Civil War. The Transcontinental Railroad is 1869, and then the sort of like peak of railroad building in the U.S. is in the 1870s until the Panic of 1873 hits, and that kind of collapses the railroad industry and sort of slows down railroad building, and we turn to building railroads abroad and all sorts of stuff like that. So like 1850s to the 1870s, kind of height of railroads. Before railroads, we have things like canals, as I mentioned. Steamboats are also a really big part of industry in this time period. Steamboats, remember, would let you go upriver against the current, which was a big deal for the Mississippi in particular. And then if we go back further, we're even talking about just things like paved roads and turnpikes, bridges over, fairly small bodies of water, etc. So this is a good slide to kind of pause on and freeze and check out. In addition to transportation, new sort of inventions and innovations. The key concepts, if you go back like 2-3 slides, lists out agriculture, technology, and commerce, I think, are the three. So it's good to know a couple for each of those like categories. So here's some examples of early agricultural innovations. I already mentioned the cotton gin. That's totally the biggest one, which, remember, makes cleaning cotton more easy and efficient. But also stuff like this is when the John Deere Company is founded, building and manufacturing steel plows, and the mechanical reaper, which is a way of like collecting grain for the McCormick industry. You can see the impact down here, right? Farming over the course of the 1800s will slowly but steadily transform from being like an individual sort of like worker and whoever they can either hire or enslave, right, to do the labor for them, to like a mechanized industry, certainly by the end of the 1800s, where we're yielding more, like you can make and grow more, but it becomes harder for like individual family farmers to make a living or to support themselves and their families as farmers. Other innovations, non-agricultural stuff on here. Let me put myself here. So this is one of those things where you don't need to know all of these, but I would pick like one or two. Eli Whitney, the cotton gin guy, also innovates interchangeable parts for weapons, for guns. I think the telegraph is a really great one to know. Kind of a parallel arc to the railroad in terms of like when it's at its sort of height and its most popular. The printing press, which allows for cheap papers like penny press to be like sort of very widely read and widely in circulation is the word I'm looking for by the time of the Civil War. So these are all some, again, good examples on this slide in particular. With anything, but certainly with the market revolution or the first half of the Industrial Revolution, one of the big things the College Board wants you to know is like, okay, what are the effects of all of these changes? There's a lot of changes, right, over a fairly short amount of time. So lots of effects as well. So if we're kind of moving from left to right here, Industrial Revolution increases mobility, both like literally people moving around the country more easily, and also increases social mobility. So if you have like a little bit of money and you can invest that like smartly, you can go rags to riches, right, as a result of the Industrial Revolution. If you get in on like the ground floor of like railroads early, that's how we get our first millionaires and billionaires in the United States. Now, as we've talked about, if you don't have any money or if you don't get on that ground floor early, you're going to go down, right? We're going to see that growth, or excuse me, the gap, the wealth gap is a big result of the Industrial Revolution as well, especially by the time we get to the second half. But it does allow for greater mobility for some anyway. Another big impact is on sort of like social and gender roles. We see the rise of a new type of middle class, where the father goes out to work, right, in some sort of industrial or office job, and the mother, the wife, stays home inside the spheres of the home. So we see changing gender and family roles. Talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. We also see the beginning of a new sector, well, not new, but a growing sector of the American economy that we will call wage labor, or in the lead up to the Civil War is often called free labor. This is often really confusing for students because free labor sounds like maybe you mean slavery, like they're not being paid, so they're free. But what we mean by free labor is just not enslaved. So wage labor is really like a better way of saying that. These are people working for wages, right? It's not just that like I live on my farm and then I eat the food that I grow on my farm. It's like I go to a job and then they pay me wages and I get a paycheck. So that's going to be a growing sector of the American economy and politics. We also see a massive wave of immigration for some reason that I am not sure of. The College Board puts the first wave immigration stuff in historical period 5, so we'll be talking about it in that video in more depth. But I do like to mention it here because it's definitely an impact of the Industrial Revolution. It's caused like a pull factor, right, for immigration. And then of course we also have regional specialization as the North and the South and the West increasingly develop specializations, which we'll see a little bit more in a map in just a sec. So just a couple things in a little bit more detail. The changing gender roles, a good term to remember for this is the era of the cult of domesticity. This is a historian term. It's not a term that people used at the time, but we use this as historians to talk about the fact that kind of starting with the Industrial Revolution, like in the 1800s, throughout the 1800s, we see the rise of these very sort of strict and very policed gender roles of separate spheres, where the idea was that you have this sort of like public sphere of the man, and that's the world of like work and, you know, turmoil and conflict, and then you have the private sphere of the home, the domestic sphere, and that's the sphere where sort of women belong and where they sort of have their rule and their domain. There have always been gender roles in every society ever, but there's always periods where they're stricter and then where they're like a little bit more looser, able to be transgressed more easily. And this is a very strict set of gender roles. Doesn't mean that everybody lived this way, like, oh, no women worked outside the house. Plenty of women did, especially if you were poor. But you were challenging something, right? You were sort of going against something, and you wouldn't maybe be seen as like a real woman if you were transgressing these gender norms. So if you get a picture, an image like either of these two on the slide here, where it's very sort of like domestically focused and again focused on the sort of like interior of the home, they may be trying to ask you about these, you know, gender roles known as the cult of domesticity. Also, again, on the specific impacts of the Industrial Revolution, this is a really great map just to sort of like pause and spend some time taking a look at, because it does a great job highlighting what the College Board calls regional specialization, which is to say that over the 1800s, the economies and then therefore societies of the different regions of the country start to develop very differently because they can trade with each other more easily, right? The South doesn't need to make as much stuff because they can just buy it from the North, and, you know, vice versa. So in the South, we see cotton production in pink. We see breadbasket crops, corn and wheat in particular in green in the middle there, and the West in particular. And then up at the top, it's like dairy, cattle, and hay is the orange, but you should pay particular attention to all those little red tents that look like monopoly houses that represent textile mills, and then the other little factories that look like little factories in black. So again, this is a great one to pause on, just to kind of absorb some of the details of what is being grown and where it is being grown. Of course, most specific like regional specification, and something that is equally as impactful as the Industrial Revolution, so the same level of like national economic, you know, reshaping, is the cotton boom. The cotton boom starts with the invention, the patenting of the cotton gin invented in 1793, patented in 1794 by Eli Whitney. It really kicks off right around 1800 or 1810, and the cotton boom is at its height in like the 1820s, 1830s. This is a period of boom in cotton production, right, that impacts a lot, really around the country, but definitely especially in the South. This is the period when the South really shifts to like a monocrop culture, right, where it's not just like plantation agriculture broadly, but it is very specifically growing cotton, which had not been widely grown before the cotton gin because it just wasn't very cost effective. And what we can see on the two maps here from 1820 to 1860 is cotton production expands. Cotton eats land, right? It demands a lot of land. It's a very land intensive crop, and it tends to kind of ruin land if you grow it on there for too long. So there's this big race for more land to grow cotton on, and that is why we really push to move out into places like Mississippi and Arkansas. This demand for cotton land is behind a lot of things that might seem unrelated on the surface, like the Trail of Tears, for example, is caused largely by the desire of the Jackson administration to clear out sort of prime Georgia land for, small American farmers to grow cotton on. And, you know, things like the Texas Revolution, as American settlers who move to Texas and want to grow cotton there. The Texas government doesn't want them to. So the cotton boom and cotton expansion is really behind a lot of like American politics and expansion in this time period. And again, it's shifting the power of the South from like the kind of like the old South or the northern South in Virginia, where it was for a long time, down into what we're going to call the deep South. So places like Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, that are going to be at the forefront of this region during the Civil War period. Other really big impact of cotton boom, of course, is on the institution of slavery. And so sort of the next few slides, we're talking basically about like impacts of the cotton boom broadly in the South, and then specifically on the institution of slavery, which is what these two key concepts here, 4.10 and 4.11, this is a long one, sorry, what they deal with. So just, that's the westward migration thing that I was talking about here. It's just another one where you can see it. And in particular, if you draw your attention to all of the little purple dots on here. Each of those represents about 2,000 enslaved people in 1850, and you can see how much that superimposes over that pink cotton land, right? There's enslaved people in other areas too, but very much like the densest cotton concentration of enslaved labor is in cotton growing areas, and then also the blue down there, which is sugar as well. Our sort of continuity and change over time slavery list that we've been adding to for the last couple of videos here is an update for the 1800s. Remember that at the beginning of like the Jeffersonian era, right, when Jefferson became president right around the time of the Revolution, I think there was a sense among a lot of sort of top Americans that slavery was sort of on its way out, right? It wasn't really as profitable as it used to be. In fact, it was kind of expensive, and several states were outlawing slavery, and Congress outlaws the transcontinental slave trade in 1808. We see people like Thomas Jefferson very clearly acknowledging that like slavery is bad, even though he says it's a necessary evil. This is the whole famous quote where he says it's like we have a wolf by the ears, right? We can't quite let it go because it'll eat us, but like we don't like it, it's bad. So we definitely see, I think, a consensus that slavery is regrettable, let's say, and that it might potentially be on its way out. And then the cotton boom changes that, right? It creates an almost overnight demand for enslaved labor. It rapidly increases the prices of enslaved people, which is a really creepy thing to talk about, but is how people were talking about it in this time period. Specifically, it increases the domestic slave trade. Now that we can no longer import enslaved labor directly from Africa, we are doing a lot more trading inside of the United States. We have enslaved people who have, for generations, lived in Virginia, being sold down to Mississippi, say, to work in cotton plantations down there. And increasingly, especially as we get towards the 1850s, we're going to see sort of a new generation of Southern politicians arguing not that slavery is like a necessary evil, like we kind of acknowledge that it's bad, but we need it, but that it is in fact a positive good. This is a phrase that's really associated with John C. Calhoun, who is a South Carolina senator from like the 1830s to about the 1850s. The positive good idea being that like slavery is good, right? It's good for the South. It's good for enslaved people. It's good for enslavers, right? It's a good institution. Like we defend it with our lives, right? We will talk more about this in the Historical Period 5 review videos. It's a big part of the road to the revolution, but that transition is happening in this time period. We also see resistance to slavery in this time period as well as it grows. In particular, the beginnings of an abolitionist movement, which is important enough that it gets its own slide, and also several large-scale slave rebellions. Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 is definitely the biggest or the most famous. The College Board will frequently ask when you get asked questions about slavery, about sort of like the responses of people who lived under slavery to the institution of slavery, like sort of how were they sort of living their lives, or how were they dealing with life under these institutions. And these are two kind of good words or good categories to remember. And when we look at resistance to slavery, we tend to see sort of two things going on. We see covert or secret resistance, not overt, right, which is the other category, which is like obvious or open or above board. I'll start kind of with the overt because I think that's the more kind of like well-known. Overt resistance is things like self-emancipating, which is like running away, right, taking yourself out of the system at great personal cost to yourself and your family often. Rebellions, right, which don't generally tend to be successful and usually cause a lot of backlash in the form of new slave codes, but are a powerful statement, right, of resistance to slavery and to the institution of slavery. And then much more commonly in sort of like people's day-to-day lives, we see these sort of covert resistance, which can be anything from just like maintaining your community and your humanity in the face of this inhumane institution by handing down cultural institutions or family practices, resistance against your enslaver through like kind of how do I say, like means that can be kind of explained away, like the work slowdowns or breaking tools or like faking being sick to kind of resist, the machinery that is around you. Secret or encoded messages, using things like songs to communicate in ways that you were not supposed to communicate. Meeting at night secretly in contravention and in defiance of slave codes. Again, establishing families and communities. Right, all of those. Anything that you can look at that would be like, this is me like asserting and maintaining my humanity in this inhumane system. Those are things that can very much should be considered resistance to slavery as well, if you get a question that asks about that. Moving on, it's always a hard one to transition out of. Moving on, we are going to sort of return to the topic of politics, which we started with this unit, and I kind of talked a little bit generally about what was going on with like the political parties and like Jefferson's election and things like that, because the big sort of central political project of this time period really centers around Andrew Jackson and his presidency, and so there's a few things that you need to know about him and his era. In particular, what the College Board calls the rise of participatory democracy. So this is not republic, small r, but now we're starting to use the word democracy, small d, instead. And we're going to see an increase in participation, meaning an increase in like people participating, right? People doing democracy stuff, especially in no small amount, changes in voting. A big sort of CCOT for this whole course is like who can vote, right? So we start out under George Washington with the only people who can vote are white men over the age of 21, and in basically every colony and then every state at the start of the nation, you had to have some sort of wealth. Some states had property requirements. Some states had requirements like you had to pay tax, right, at a certain level, but some requirement that basically said you had to be wealthy. And what starts to happen in like the 1810s and 1820s especially is that those property requirements start to be dropped. Some of the new Western states that come in just never have them to begin with. I think Kentucky is a good example of one of these, yeah. And then other states that had them to begin with are going to drop them at various points, kind of in response to the fact that the new states don't have them. So certainly by the time that Andrew Jackson's like president, by the middle of Andrew Jackson's presidency, let's say, there's really almost no states left where you have a property requirement. So you still have to be white, you still have to be male, you still have to be 21 or older, but you no longer have to be rich. So we have this constituency that Andrew Jackson usually calls the common man, right, who can now vote for the first time, and they're pretty into it. Like they're coming out, they are attending rallies. This is the era of popular campaigning. We're going to see the beginnings of third parties, like single issue third parties for the first time, like two is not enough, more parties. And we also do see the development of two new dominant political parties that look more like our modern political parties. This era is basically when modern American political structures are born. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, that first party system, they don't really look or operate a lot like our modern political parties. These, the Democrats and the Whigs, they will. They have conventions. They nominate candidates. They have slates that are like, there's a president and there's a governor candidate and there's like a mayor in your town who's a Whig as well, right? They have printed ballots. Again, they hold campaign rallies, right? A lot of those things that we associate with kind of like modern, like what is a political party, sort of date from this time period or are developed in this time period. So that's one big thing that you need to know about this era is, again, this rise of participatory democracy. In another way to sort of like think about this or look at this is comparing like what did sort of like democracy mean in the Jeffersonian era, early 1800s, versus the Jacksonian era, like the 1820s and the 1830s. I sort of yanked this graphic off of the internet somewhere, so I think it's a good one to kind of pause and take a look at. And you can see that there's some things that are shared, or that both talk a lot about like states' rights in particular. Jackson really saw himself as sort of like the heir to Jefferson. I don't know if Jefferson would have felt the same way, but a big difference is that Jefferson was elite, right? He was from like one of the wealthiest families in the colonies, and he very much believed that we should be governed by, an agrarian republic of like, landowning gentlemen like himself. Whereas Jackson really leans more into this idea of the common man, right? Of, again, white men, right? But sort of who are not as elite, still having some sort of say in the government or still having some sort of economic opportunities. Jackson as president. This is like a list of top hits from Jackson's presidency. He shows up a bunch, especially in the multiple choice in particular. This is a commonly used political cartoon. Jackson's critics often called him King Andrew I as a way of implying, somewhat accurately, that he was really using executive power more than any president before him had. He vetoed a bunch of stuff, which was not really something that previous presidents did, and he, ignores the Supreme Court in the Indian removal case, among other things. So kind of like a quick rundown up here. Jackson is the one who institutes the spoils system, which is the idea that a new president comes in and then they fire all of the previous administration's bureaucrats and they put their own guys in. This is not like inherently a bad thing, right? Jackson was like, well, we should have a government where it rotates and you've got like new people in charge of things and fresh voices, and that's a decent argument there. The problem is that this pretty quickly becomes basically sort of like you can pay for a position. Like if you donate to my campaign, then like you get to be the assistant undersecretary of the Treasury of whatever, Massachusetts. So by the time we get the Gilded Age, this has become a problem, like a bribery problem. But it does begin under Jackson here. Native American policy, big thing to remember. Jackson administration Declaration is that the basic policy is that all Native American tribes, not individual Native American people, but Native American tribes must move west of the Mississippi River. And particularly this applies to the 5 civilized tribes down in the southeast, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, who have maintained control of some of their lands largely by assimilating and by sort of also plantation culture and growing cotton and enslaving people and things like that. They're going to be pushed out as like a long saga. The Indian Removal Act, I think, is signed in 1830, if I'm not mistaken, and then the final like Cherokee Trail of Tears, that's in like 1838. So this is a long ongoing thing. It takes a while, but they are successfully and very tragically pushed off of their land west of the Mississippi River into what is today Oklahoma, what was at the time just called Indian Territory. Next one down, the nullification crisis. This is the whole thing where we have this tariff of abominations, right? This very high tariff that was passed right before Andrew Jackson becomes president. And then when he gets in, he doesn't I think he doesn't move fast enough basically for a lot of states in the South. So South Carolina tries to nullify the tariff. They're basically like, we're not paying this. You can't make us. Jackson threatens to send the army down. They work out a compromise. The main significant and important thing about the nullification crisis is that it's a revival of that question of nullification, and it's sort of a foreshadowing of the issue of states' rights that is going to become such a big component of the road to the revolution. So we can see a lot of the same sort of like rhetoric and arguments that we're going to see 20 years later when we get to the 1850s are making sort of an appearance here around the nullification crisis. Next one down, last one, probably the most famous, Jackson's war against the National Bank, which he really personifies and hates and is going to successfully kill. This is the end of the Bank of the United States. And for the next 20, 30 years, we have some problems because we don't really have anywhere to put our money as a federal government. I would say probably the biggest thing to know about the Jackson era is that this time period in American politics are very much revolve around individual personalities. Like the Democratic Party doesn't have what I would consider a really coherent, what do we believe in set of beliefs in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. This is basically just like the Andrew Jackson Party, right? This is the party for Andrew Jackson and people like him and people who come from the same place as him and sort of think like him. And it's effective. He's popular, right? There's a lot of people who like him who think like him. But again, it's not like an ideological party quite so much. I think the Whigs are a little bit more ideological. Speaking of the Whigs, here's the Whigs. This is a good summary of the Whigs if you have forgotten about them, which is fine in general. This is our second party system, right? The Democrats versus the Whigs. The Whigs just start out as the I hate Andrew Jackson club, right? This is just all of the people who don't like Jackson, but they do kind of coalesce around a set of ideas. They tend to be more northern. They tend to be more pro-business. This is like Henry Clay's American Plan, right? Sort of like part 2. So those types of ideas of more nationalist, right? A political party that wants to see policies that seem like they will kind of connect the nation economically and support, tariffs and things like that. They also tend to be, of the two parties, the more pro-reform, although they're not fully pro-reform in ways that we'll talk about in a little bit. Key Whigs, Henry Clay, who runs for president 3 times, I think, as a Whig, twice as a Whig, I think, and then the third time was the earlier one before the political parties. Also, Daniel Webster, key senator, William Henry Harrison, and John Tyler are the two elected presidents of the, William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor are the 2 elected presidents of the Whigs. They both die in office, and that is bad for the Whig Party. So this is the Whigs, again, a national political party. The Democrats are also national. This is not a northern and southern party. We won't see that until we get to the road to the Civil War. Here's the sort of next part of that political timeline that we were looking at the beginning of the video. In particular, you can see here in the Jacksonian era, the popping up of those third parties that I mentioned, like the Liberty Party right here, which was an abolitionist party, and down here, the Know Nothing Party, which was the anti-immigrant party that I'll talk about a little bit more in the next video, the Free Soil Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery, and then here in the yellow, this is the Whigs, which took a little while to kind of coalesce or get themselves together. They call themselves the National Republicans for a while. You don't really need to know anything about that. Last couple of key concepts. I know we're going long here. This is a long unit. Frontier settlement. You do need to know a little bit about sort of westward expansion in this time period. Most of the Manifest Destiny stuff, like the Mexican-American War, is in the next historical period. But you should be aware of the Indian Wars stuff that we've talked about already, again, especially the War of 1812 Tecumseh stuff, and then the Trail of Tears that I was just mentioning down here. And I also listed on here a couple of those treaties that I mentioned at the beginning, so you can sort of see where those are at a little more. There's the Adams-Onis Treaty and the Treaty of 1818, which also split Oregon, was jointly occupied by the United States and Great Britain for 30 years. This is when that starts as well. Last, like, big topic for this unit, and it is a big one, deals with basically a little bit changing culture, but more so the Second Great Awakening and then the antebellum social reforms of this era. So first up, cultural stuff. One of the things the College Board wants you to trace over these first few historical periods is sort of the development of like American culture through art and literature. Particularly, what that means is that we're starting to see the publication or creation of artworks that are uniquely American in some way. They're not just sort of like copies of what's going on in like Great Britain or France, but they are like tied to American history or American literature. So we get authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne or Edgar Allan Poe are kind of commonly cited ones. We get artists like the Hudson River School of Artists, which is a group of artists who were based in upstate New York that paint these really big, beautiful like landscapes that kind of like romanticize the grandeur and glory of the American like landscape because we're such a big, pretty country. This is the era of the Transcendentalists, if you remember reading or talking about them. That's an intellectual movement. And then again, the patriotic arch. This is when like our capital is designed and we sort of are like, yay, we're just like the Greeks. Look at our, Temple of Congress with all of its columns, right? So there's a lot of that kind of like identity building through culture that's going on. This is fairly minor, I would say, as far as its likelihood of actually showing up on the exam. So good little side note. More significant cultural changes, more likely to show up on the exam, is the Second Great Awakening. We talked about the First Great Awakening a couple of units ago, historical periods ago. First Great Awakening was in the 1740s. This is the Second Great Awakening. It is about 80 years later, kind of 1810s, 1820s is really its height. It starts a little earlier than that, goes a little later, but that's sort of where it's at its height. Like the First Great Awakening, this is a religious revival, right? Ministers who think that our religion has gotten sort of like sad and boring and who want to kind of like wake people up to, religion and make them feel sort of like passionately engaged with it again. So that's a similarity. Unlike the First Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening really focused on Old Testament style, like fear of hell, right, as the emotion that they were trying to evoke. The Second Great Awakening is much more into what they called perfectionism, or the more kind of New Testament ideas that like mankind can reach perfection and that it is possible to kind of like make the world a better place. And so what we see out of the Second Great Awakening that we did not see from the First Great Awakening quite so much is that there is a social reform element. If you zapped yourself back in time and you went and listened to the speeches, the sermons, of a Second Great Awakening preacher like Charles Grandison Finney, who's probably the most famous. He would be talking a lot about Jesus and Christian religion, but he would also be talking probably a lot about ending alcohol abuse, temperance, or slavery, anti-slavery abolition. Those two topics in particular become kind of like intertwined with Second Great Awakening sermons. So again, lots of similarities to the First Great Awakening, but others also different in that there is this kind of social reform component as well. Second Great Awakening really starts in upstate New York, which people call the burned over district because there's so many revivals held there in like clusters. And it's also out of that area of the country where we see several new denominations emerge, just like in the First Great Awakening, sort of pluralism of religion, right, in this time period. Definitely the most famous and impactful is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS Mormon Church, right? We also see the Seventh-day Adventist, the Shakers, right, that we talked about in this time period. So that's the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening really leads directly into, or as one of the that's interesting, one of the major causes of the antebellum reform movements of this era. So this slide is basically causes of the antebellum reform movements. You can see the Second Great Awakening right in the top and the middle, but there's others too. Like there's other reasons why we see this first big wave of social reform here in the like 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, which is when most of these movements are going on. Some of it is that participatory democracy. People are more excited. They can vote more, right? They're more into kind of like, joining organizations and things like that. Some of it is a response to the changes caused by the Industrial Revolution. Society's changed a lot very rapidly, and that does tend to lead to calls for reform movements. Some of it is stuff that's going on abroad. This is a big period of change in Europe as well, and we tend to reflect that. There are big democratic revolutions in a bunch of countries in 1848. England in particular has a really big abolition and women's rights movement that we like. There's a lot of back and forth between us and them. There are activists and their activists, that increase in print culture that I've talked about, right? So there's lots of things that are sort of feeding into the creation of all of these antebellum reform movements. And this is our last topic, but it's going to take us a little while. So remember that there's several major eras of social reform in American history. There's this one. There's the progressive era at the end of the 1800s, and then there's the sort of civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s. So this one, antebellum, this is like, again, 1830s to 1850s. Progressive era, 1890s to like 1910s, 1920s. And then civil rights era, 1950s to 1960s. And very, 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 very common for the College Board to ask you to compare some aspects of those, like compare like the whatever role of women in the progressive era and the antebellum reform era. So we're gonna kind of go through this and just compare a little bit the major reform movements of this era, and what you should be keeping in mind, or what you should be sort of doing in your own notes or your own studying, is comparing this to those other two future reform eras as well. Again, very common. So this chart basically moves from, on the left, the most like widespread and most mainstream of all of these reform movements, to the sort of most radical, most kind of like fringe reform movements in those last two columns. So we're going to kind of move across this chart in the same way. So first up, temperance. This is the movement to end alcohol abuse, or sort of drinking in general. Temperance advocates basically saw alcohol as the source of all social problems, or most social problems. They saw it as a source of domestic violence and poverty and crime and all of the other kind of bad things that are going on in society. And so the theory was, if we can convince people to stop drinking, close saloons, things like that, then we can like make society better in a bunch of different ways. Temperance is not yet prohibition. Prohibition is like, we're going to pass a law and like you won't be allowed to drink. This era of the temperance movement was much more focused on like anti-drinking pledges. They used a lot of propaganda. This was the whole thing where we saw with like the guy who like, you know, descends into like chaos and then eventually like, commits like vile acts basically as a result of being an alcoholic. And again, this was one of the movements that was the most connected to like religious language, religious rhetoric. And of all of these movements, this is the one that's the strongest in the South, right? Like abolition is not going to be a strong movement in the Southern United States, but temperance is. So that's one of the things that makes it the most widespread. Also very associated with female activism. Next one in the middle, asylum and penal reform. This is like reforming institutions. Remember that in this time period, like we just had sort of jails, and they would just kind of toss anybody that like they wanted to get out of society into jail. So it was like petty criminals, serious criminals, like people who were super poor and couldn't take care of themselves, people who were blind, like people who were disabled in some other way, all just sort of like tossed into this mess. And so reformers like Dorothea Dix wanted states to create separate institutions, like a school for the blind and like a penitentiary for, specific types of prisoners. So what they did was a lot of petitioning of like state and local governments to create and fund these institutions, which is fairly successful. The Dorothea Dix Memorial Hospital in Raleigh was one of the first. They called them insane asylums in this time period. That's not a term we would want to use today, but so that's a successful example of this reform movement. Education, this is a Horace Mann joint here. Horace Mann was the head of the Massachusetts State School Board. Massachusetts is the first state to really have any such thing. And his sort of vision was basically taxpayer-funded public education, right? That the state would take some of its money and then use that money to provide school that's free to any kid who lives in the state. Not all the way up to high school like we have it today, but like at least at the elementary school level. And the idea here that Horace Mann and other education reformers had was that, okay, this is good, we'll increase access to education. And we can also use these schools to kind of like Americanize our population. Take all of these new like, Irish Catholic immigrants and kind of like, sit them down with, Guffey readers and teach them the story of how like, George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and then he could not tell a lie and like, yay, and like Bible parables and stuff like that. So education as sort of Americanization, I think, is a big focus in this time period. Once we start to get out to the last two columns here, number one, both the women's rights movement and the abolition movement are pretty connected. Like lots of the activists are engaged in both of these two reform movements. And number two, both of these reform movements are very small. It's like a small amount of people, vocal, but small. And also they're very like radical. The entire time that they exist, they're considered sort of radical by like most of society. There would have been plenty of women who were pro-temperance and were involved in like their local, women's temperance union of, Chapel Hill, but were not in favor of women's rights in this time period. That would have been extremely common. So the women's rights movement really kicks off at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. I was going to say it wasn't on here, so you can see Seneca Falls Declaration down here. That convention, which is about, I think something like 248 people are there, so when I say small, that's what I mean, is the first to produce a public call for women's suffrage, right, the right to vote for women. That's not going to happen until 1920, so you can see what I mean when I say like it's radical and it's going to take a long time. The other things that are going on here in addition to suffrage is we're also going to see a push for things like property laws, allowing married women to own their own property, and just sort of like kind of equal rights in the public sphere type stuff. Very common like wrong answer type from the College Board is to give you something that's right, but it's like out of time period. So you might get a question that would ask you like, well, which of the following were like the women's rights movement like not, in favor of in this time period? And it would have like abortion rights on there or something that's really more from the modern era of the women's rights movement. So when we have these movements like women's rights that spread out over multiple generations, so try to keep in mind kind of how their goals change, right? This is the suffrage era, and then we get suffrage, and then the goals change, right? Last column on here, I think the most radical in this time period, although it's more successful and more immediately than the women's rights movement, is abolition. This is not the first time that we've seen anti-slavery activism in the United States, right? We've had things like the American Colonization Society that push for like voluntary or gradual emancipation, like trying to convince people to free enslaved people and then send them back to Africa or whatnot. But the era of the 1830s is when we see the first real abolitionist societies. Abolitionists are extremist even among the anti-slavery population because what they wanted was an immediate end to slavery, like now, no gradual, no sort of scaling down, no compensation for enslavers, right? Just end slavery now, like that's it. And that was an extreme position in this time period. They tended to be seen as very aggressive in their tactics. They had a whole array of them. They had a lot of printing press type stuff. They had newspapers. They were big into like finding and then publishing slave narratives, right? Narratives of people who were enslaved and had escaped, like Frederick Douglass. They worshipped in integrated churches deliberately. They wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters to enslavers and like sent them through the mail. Charleston, South Carolina holds like a big mail bonfire at one point because they're sending so many letters and anti-slavery pamphlets. They send a bunch of petitions to Congress. Congress has to pass the gag rule to like get the couple of sympathetic congressmen to stop reading these petitions on the House floor. So again, they're perceived as being very like they're pushing, right? They're very sort of aggressive. There's a lot of really good abolitionists. Please try to know the names of at least one or two of them. Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison are definitely the two most famous. It's good to know a couple of people beyond them. Please do not be like the student whose exam that I graded that didn't know that Sojourner Truth was a woman and an abolitionist. So just to know the names of a couple of these key abolitionists, please. And again, also understand that this was considered quite a radical position to, and I think even through the period of the Civil War. What we are going to see as we head into the next historical period, not so much increased support for abolition, a little bit that, but definitely increased support for like anti-slavery more broadly, and specifically opposing the spread of slavery into new territories or other territories. So I'm going to sort of move myself out of the way. So if you want to pause here and get more of this chart, you can. But this is the end of historical period 4, and I will see you guys back here for historical period 5. Thanks.